This is a big pile of steer manure right in the middle of my garden. And this is a little bag of chicken manure. These are just two of the manures that I use. I think it's a great natural way to amend your soil. Join me today as I discuss how I use manures and tell you about some of the concerns you need to be aware of. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and let's get it right out. Manure is animal poop. It's as simple as that. Different animals have different poops that could be beneficial for the garden or maybe detrimental to you and the garden. And that's just one of the things I'll be talking about today. For the most part, I think you should be looking for the type of animals that have a plant-based diet. Those are the manures that tend to be best for our garden. So steer manure, chicken manure, horse manure, worm manure, alpaca manure. Those are all manures that I use in my garden. A lot of it depends on what you have access to. If you have access to a lot of rabbit poop, well then rabbit manure could be great for your garden. But you should stay away from the manures of animals with a meat-based diet. The high-protein manure breaks down differently in the soil, and it doesn't give you that same vegetative amendment that the plant-based animal manure will. But more importantly, especially for dogs and cats, their manure, their poop, can have pathogens and parasites that can be harmful to humans. The roundworm that might be in your pet will lay eggs, and those eggs will survive the digestive tract of the animals and reach the soil if that's what you're using to amend. And those eggs, well, they can hatch and they can infect you. Before you know it, just by working in the garden, you've got parasites growing under your skin. It's best to just stay away from it completely because you really don't need to use cat and dog poop in your garden. If you have a lot of it and you want to do it, you can compost those manures. But you need to have a sustained compost temperature of 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit over a period of time to kill those pathogens and parasites. I just avoid dog and cat poop. And in this area, this is where Lily does her business, I'm not growing anything. And by focusing her attention on this as her area to do her business, I keep her out of other areas of the garden and avoid those potential problems for myself. The primary benefit of manures in the garden is as a soil amendment, either after adding it to the compost pile or directly amending the soil in your bed. It has organic material in it, and it has nutrients in it. It's great food for your soil microorganisms. But try not to think of manure as a fertilizer, because while it might be a great amendment and really improve the structure of the soil, some of the manures are really quite low on the nutrients. Alpaca manure is on one end of the spectrum. It has very low levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium because of the multiple stomachs of the alpaca. By the time it comes out the other end, most of the nutrients have already been absorbed. On the other end of the spectrum, you have chicken manure that is actually pretty high in nitrogen and has a good amount of phosphorus and potassium. Between those two levels, you have a number of different manures with different nutrient levels. So think about it as an opportunity to improve your soil and not so much as a fertilizer for your plants. I also use some manures as a top dressing on my beds, and I don't work it into the soil as an amendment. On a bed like this, asparagus, I really can't get in there and amend the soil. So as I add more organic matter each year, I add it from the top down. And this is my bag of alpaca manure. I got this from a local gardening friend who raises alpaca. And even though this is lower in nutrients, it still has nutrients and it still can improve the soil in the bed. And so I'll go ahead and spread it on the surface after I've added a layer of compost, and I'm just going to let it sit. I'll cover this area with mulch later on, but for the most part, this is the new home of this alpaca manure. And because of those multiple stomachs, what comes out can actually be used right away. As I'll discuss with the chicken manure, you should wait for some of these manures to age. Alpaca doesn't need to be aged. It can have E. coli and salmonella, and so using it near food crops is something you should be cautious about. But this is my first season of this asparagus. I just planted it last year, and so I'm not going to be eating this asparagus for another couple years. I'm not going to use any of this manure on a salad crop, a crop that I'm going to be eating right away. That's why I think it's a good idea to amend it. But for a bed like this, it still has a couple years before I can harvest. I can go ahead and add the manure on top, and as I water and as it rains, this will gradually break down, decompose, and add the nutrients to the soil. There are a few other manures that can be used straight out of the animal and into the garden. A great example of this is rabbit manure. But for the most part, the large majority of manures should be aged or composted before you add them to your soil, especially chicken manure. Now, I get my chicken manure from my daughter and from my neighbor, and it comes in 2 different bags. My daughter is great about this. So this bag is nothing but chicken poop that she gets out of the roosting box of her coop. A lot of the other bags I have, as I'll show you in a minute, are mixed with the bedding. And so whether it's straight manure or manure that's mixed with bedding, you can determine how you're going to use it best in your garden. Chicken manure has a very high nitrogen component, so I like adding it to my compost pile as a nitrogen boost. This is definitely one that you should not add straight to your garden. The high levels of ammonia in the chicken manure are enough to damage and even kill your plants. And there's also the potential for E. coli and salmonella. So age it in a bag or put it into a compost pile to break down before you put it into your garden. For the chicken manure that is mixed with a bedding, I vary the use depending on the bedding. If it's a bedding of straw, which can break down pretty quickly, well, that high nitrogen of the chicken manure and the carbon of the straw can be a great addition to the compost pile. But if it's mixed with wood chips or wood shavings, well, that wood doesn't break down as quickly in the compost pile. So instead, I like to use it very similar way as the alpaca manure. I'll top dress around my fruit trees with the chicken manure that is mixed with the wood shavings. And then I'll just let the rain and my watering work this down through the wood chips and into the soil. Now, I'm not as concerned about E. coli and salmonella because it's a tree and I'm not going to be eating from the ground. And over time, this is an easy way to improve the soil, especially when you have a heavy mulch over it. There are some additional concerns when you use manures from animals that live on a farm or a ranch, like steer manure and cow manure and horse manure. And it's because of the diet of the animal. Many ranchers will use salt licks around the barn, and the animals love the salt. Well, that salt can find its way into the manure and contaminate your soil. I had this problem at the Galileo School Garden. One year we had a donation of literally tons of cow manure. Well, it was great to amend our beds with it, but we started noticing that the plants didn't do so well. And a partner of mine actually did a test on the manure, and it was extremely high in salt. At the end of the season, after all of the rains, we actually found a layer, a couple inches thick at the bottom of the pile of the salt that had leached through the pile. So ask that question. Are salt licks being used by those animals? And it's helpful to ask questions about the feed that the animals eat. In the United States, there's a lot of the hay that we buy at ranch centers that has been treated with herbicides. Among them, aminopyralids that can work their way through the animal and end up in the manure. And it takes many months for those herbicides to dissipate and pose few problems to your plants. But if you don't wait that time, well, by amending your soil with a fresher manure that might have been contaminated with an herbicide from the hay, your plants might end up being stunted or killed. So in all cases, when I'm using one of these type of manures, I let it age for a long period of time. This pile's been here about 6 months. I'm planning probably another 4 months before I even think about using this manure in my garden. And just putting it into a pile is good enough. It does start to break down and decompose on the inside. So when it comes time to use it, I just scrape away the outside to put into my compost pile or create a new pile and focus on the material on the inside. And so a manure like this, especially since it's been from an area with bedding, will break down. This straw will decompose, and when it comes time to use it in my garden, it'll be aged, mostly composted, and a great soil amendment. Now, a manure that I really love is worm manure, otherwise known as worm castings. And this is really the ideal soil amendment. It's packed with beneficial bacteria, it has nutrients, it has minerals. It doesn't have those issues with salt or chemical contamination. It doesn't produce high ammonia that's going to kill the plants. It's just a great amendment for your soil. The problem is that it's hard to get in large amounts without paying a lot of money or having a lot of worms, and my worms just don't produce enough of it. So I use this manure primarily in my potting mixes. So when I add soil to my green stock vertical growing system, that potting soil has the worm castings in it. Hopefully at some point I might have enough worms producing enough castings that I can start adding it as a primary soil amendment. But in the process, those potted plants, not just in the green stock, but also in my grow area, those potted plants have a potting mix with some of the worm castings in it. So when I transplant out to my garden, some of this worm manure is finding its way into my other beds. Availability may be an issue with you for the other types of manure as well. I'm lucky in that I have some local sources for the manure. But if you don't have those sources, you might look for bagged manures. And I'll often buy bagged composted dairy manure to mix in with some of my potting soils that I use in my containers. It's composted. It's actually blended to be pretty fine material, and it works great in my mixes. Regardless of your source, you should be thinking about adding manure to your beds, even with those concerns that I've highlighted. It's all about the soil. Compost is a great amendment for your soil, but if you can add variety, well then you'll increase the number of soil microorganisms because there'll be different types of food for the different type of organisms. And manures are a different type of food. They're improving the structure of the soil and they're improving the nutrition of the soil. And it's definitely something you should consider. The soil is important. And if you want to learn more about amending and soil, I suggest you watch one of these Gardener Scott videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.